Hello, and welcome to this edition of Inside the Naval Postgraduate School. From our campus here in Monterey, California, I'm your host, Petty Officer Danica Sermons. In this edition, we'll celebrate Military Appreciation Month at Laguna Seca's Continental Tire Monterey Grand Prix. We'll visit a local high school with the second longest held POW, Everett Alvarez. But first, we'll head to the Beaufort Sea to discuss NPS's Marginal Ice Zone program. NPS faculty with the Department of Oceanography and the Office of Naval Research recently set their sights on the Beaufort Sea. Dr. Tim Stanton and Dr. Bill Shaw are developing the Marginal Ice Zone program to study the effects of ice melts in the Arctic. Petty Officer Sean Stewart has the story.
Naval Postgraduate School research professor Tim Stanton is once again studying the effects of environmental change in the world's polar regions. But this time, he and his colleagues are turning their scientific gaze northward to the Arctic, where NPS developed instruments and student researchers are examining the effects of climate change on rapidly changing Arctic sea ice.
So the particular study is called the Marginal Ice Zone Directed Research Initiative, funded by the Office of Naval Research High Latitude Program. And it's looking at the moments, typically a week or two, when an ice flow is undergoing its destruction and it becomes what's called a marginal ice zone, a mixture of ice flows and open ocean that slowly transitions into open ocean. So it's in a sense the most complicated phase of this whole retreat of ice, and it's very important to get this right for the ocean models that we'll be using to predict ice coverage in the future.
In order to reveal the future, Stan and his team had to first develop instruments that could both survive and measure the harsh environments characterized by marginal ice zones.
We've developed autonomous ocean flux buoys that we put out on the ice sheet, on the ice flows, and they drift around for a year or two gathering data, and the whole premise is to look at the way that the ocean is interacting with the ice.
The autonomous buoys are not only an effective means of performing precise measurements, they are also more efficient and less expensive than long-term manned expeditions to the poles.
Starting after a manned ice station called Sheba in 1997-98, which is a long time ago, when we had a hotel ship moored to an ice flow for a whole year. And during that time, we all realized that we couldn't continue these $20 million very expensive experiments that happen maybe once a lifetime at a time when we were already observing the early signs of change up there. So we developed, a group of us developed autonomous, somewhat independently, autonomous instruments that could do comparable measurements, but without the expense of a manned ice camp. And the other advantage is that we, instead of just occupying one ice flow, we typically occupy 3 to 6 ice flows at any one time in the Central Arctic, greatly increasing the coverage of data.
And while Stanton's autonomous systems are not cheap, they're significantly cheaper and more effective than manned expeditions. And what they measure is painting a picture of the Arctic that is rather surprising.
It measures basically currents to a very high resolution, about 5 meters underneath the ice. And by measuring the temperature and the conductivity, we measure the temperature and salinity and the vertical flux, the vertical transport of heat through the ocean. It turns out that the ocean has a very central role in this balance of ice, because it's a massive thermal flywheel and also a potential source of heat for melting the ice. So we actually measured right below the ice what's coming and going to the ocean or from the ocean.
NPS Research Associate Professor William Shaw is working with Stanton. He traveled to the Arctic last March to deploy the first 2 buoys into Beaufort Sea.
And they were willing to dedicate the resources to allow us and 5 or 6 partner institutions to put out a dedicated array of instruments to actually watch that process unfold over a whole summer-long season.
U.S. naval interest in the Arctic is hardly new. It was strategically important to submarine warfare during the Cold War, but interest waned as the Cold War came to a close. The Arctic is back in the news today, but for very different reasons.
In the Arctic, you have the sea ice melting, which leads to sort of there being more open and navigable water up there. It affects the freshwater content of that whole system, which in turn, that affects the whole large-scale circulation of the ocean, and things like the transfer of heat from the equator up to the mid-latitudes, stuff that affects the weather in Europe. So about a lot of really important problems right now that both polar regions have important roles in.
Stanton shares Shaw's concerns. He has observed dramatic changes in the Arctic throughout his career.
We recognize from early global climate models that the Arctic was possibly the most sensitive area on the planet to small changes in the net heat content of the planet, for example. And it's very odd for that to have come to pass within my scientific career. As I said, in Chiba, we saw the first signs of freshening in the ocean mixed layer immediately below the ice, and that trend has continued, and the actual ice retreat has accelerated greatly since that time, to the point where the satellite imagery that shows the ice extent is just so dramatically different than it was a decade ago even. So it's a very sensitive indicator of climate change, predicted by global climate models, even crude ones, and the changes that were predicted have come to pass. So the response is sensitive to global warming, and the mechanisms that cause that change are still confusing to us as physicists, and it's very important that we get the physics right for these predictive models to see where it's going to end up.
But Stanton is hopeful that his work and that of his colleagues will lead to a greater understanding of the processes that are occurring in the Arctic, and eventually to greater predictability. In support of the CNO's Arctic Roadmap, a strategy designed to put the Navy ahead of Arctic climate change and its ramifications.
Thanks, MC2. Coming up after the break, we'll head to the famous corkscrew turn at Laguna Seca Raceway for Military Appreciation Month. Thanks again for tuning into this edition of Inside the Naval Postgraduate School. And remember, no matter where your service takes you, the latest breaking news from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey is always at your fingertips. Stay informed and follow us at NPS_Monterey. We'll be right back. Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca recently paid tribute to our local military and veteran community in honor of the National Military Appreciation Month. The raceway has long been a fabric of Monterey County's history, where service members served at Fort Ord, Defense Language Institute, and of course, NPS. Military faculty, staff, and students were in attendance for the Continental Tire Monterey Grand Prix powered by Mazda. They were invited to sit in on hot laps, participate in flag waving, and award race winners with their trophies. NPS Systems Engineering Lab Technician Petty Officer 2nd Class Troy Samaya was one of the service members selected to participate in an event.
We were standing out, it's called the grid, it's where all the cars line up before they start, where they place in their polling positions. And we just kind of stood there and picked the car we liked, so I picked the Aston Martin. And we just kind of stood there and people took pictures of us.
As a part of the Grand Prix programming, Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca hosted a swearing-in ceremony for 5 future sailors from the San Francisco Recruiting District. Civilians that have been selected to go to boot camp at Great Lakes, Illinois are referred to as future sailors. They are a part of what the Navy refers to as the Delayed Entry Program until their shipping date. Lieutenant Lorna Mae de Vera led those sailors in their oath.
It's a huge honor and a privilege to be that representation of these young sailors who have made that decision to become part of the Navy family and to recognize that the Navy is going to be their employer. So this is definitely a first step for them on this journey, and to be a part of that is huge.
Marine Staff Sergeant Liam Dwyer proved to be a fan favorite at the event. The active duty Marine enlisted in 2001. After an injury resulting in the loss of his leg in Afghanistan, he remained active in the Marine Corps while starting a career in racing. Dwyer raced for the first time in the Continental Tire Sports Car Challenge ST class. He was especially grateful to have competed in his first race on Military Appreciation Day.
It's a perfect mix. Appreciate the military, I'm a service member. It shows that the team I'm with actually does appreciate military. Today we're giving out free t-shirts, allowing veterans to come here for free. So being a part of that team and still being in the military shows you that there are people still out there that appreciate the military, and they want to put a military service member in the car so long as they're capable. 3
weeks after Dwyer's debut, he went on to take his first win at Lime Rock Park, competing in the Freedom Autosport Mazda MX-5. One racer did walk away with the win at Mazda Raceway Laguna Seca. Michael Lewis, a Laguna Beach-bred racer, has been competing for more than 10 years. After winning the pole position for his class, he went on to come into first place in the number 98 car. Lewis had an interesting military tie and felt a special kind of connection during Military Appreciation Day.
Racing during Military Appreciation Month is kind of special in particular because my mechanic is named as Dee. He's actually an ex-Marine, so I get a lot of stories from him, and I kind of understand a little bit more about the Marine Corps and the Armed Forces in general, and it just gives me a lot of inspiration to do what I do, because it makes my stuff seem a lot easier knowing what he had to go through in the Marine Corps. So I use it as inspiration. It's just kind of giving more respect to those men and women in the Marines and Armed Forces in general.
Army Major Jimmy Ryan, an airborne ranger and NPS alumni, shared his gratitude to Laguna Seca for their tribute and appreciation.
I'm really thankful for the support that we received from the Laguna Seca Mazda Raceway. It's been a real good interaction for disabled veterans and wounded warriors to connect the civilian populace with the military. So for Military Appreciation Day, it really means a lot.
The NPS Defense Energy Lecture Series was created as a direct result of a mandate from the Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Ray Mabus, who tasked the school with developing defense-centered energy programs that respond to the Navy's need for comprehensive energy solutions.
About 2 years ago, the Secretary asked the Naval Postgraduate School to set up a Center of Excellence in Energy. And so when I set it up, there were 3 pillars. One of them is curriculum. We have master's degrees and seminars and whatnot. We have research and we have outreach. The seminar is part of the curriculum that we've set up to help students understand what's going on in energy.
This June brought one of the world's leading energy officials, author of The Oil Curse, How Petroleum Wealth Shapes the Development of Nations, UCLA's own political science professor, Dr. Michael Ross.
Dr. Ross has a book out called The Oil Curse, and what he tries to do is he tries to use some real data to show that oil is a curse. These countries that are filled with oil are typically poor countries, and the oil tends to be more of a curse than a benefit to them. And so we thought that would be interesting for our students to observe and hear what he has to say. One of the main objectives of our energy seminar is to expand our students' minds, to show them that, hey, there's other alternatives, there's other opinions, and this was just one of them. And it was very interesting, and the students thought it was interesting also.
Ross sat down with us to detail his findings.
You look around the world, it's striking that many of the countries that are the most unstable, the most undemocratic, the most belligerent, just happen to be oil-producing countries. Okay. Venezuela, Iran, Libya, Iraq, Nigeria, the list goes on. Okay. This isn't a coincidence. The research that I've done and many others have done shows that the more oil that countries produce, particularly low and middle income countries, the more political problems they tend to have. And it's a critical issue that we need to understand better, and it has all kinds of implications for U.S. foreign policy.
Ross explains why oil-wealthy countries tend to favor autocracy over democracy.
Countries that have a lot more oil tend to have less democratic governments. And the governments themselves are able to raise all the finance they need and fund all kinds of public projects and patronage without even bothering to collect taxes. Okay. We know from our own history that taxation tends to lead to representation. When people have to pay taxes, they demand some accountability from their governments. If you are the government of an oil-rich country, you don't have to ask for taxes, and you don't have the same constraints on your government to be accountable to the people. So you tend to have governments that are sort of directed by the whims of whoever's in charge, whoever has the most power, whoever has the most influence. And that can lead to some pretty dangerous developments.
Ross contends that greater transparency is the key to reversing the oil curse.
There's a lot that can be done, I think. A key starting place is the issue of transparency. So the oil industry is, enormous. It's one of the world's largest industries, the world's largest companies. Many of them are oil companies. several $1 trillion worth of oil and gas are taken out of the ground. And yet it is one of the most opaque, least transparent industries in the world. Just as an example, when you go to the store, every little thing you buy, every appliance, every little toy or piece of food has a label on it that tells you where it came from, right? You go to the gas station on the corner and pay 50, 60, or 70 bucks to fill up your tank. You have no idea where that came from. That's a lot of money people spend. It is a world where a lot of money exchanges hands and people don't know how much and where it's going. And that, I think, is the origin of the problem in many countries, because the citizens of the Nigerias and Irans and Saudi Arabias, for example, don't know how much money their governments are getting. And without that basic knowledge, they can't hold their governments accountable. They can't say, hey, how come all this money seems to be disappearing into somebody's Swiss bank account and not going to build schools and clinics here? Okay, so the U.S. is the home of some of the world's largest oil companies. U.S.-based companies have invested several $1 trillion in the oil sectors of foreign countries. And so we have a big interest in and a lot of influence over whether there's going to be more transparency in who gives how much money to whom. And we can play a big role.
Ross believes his findings can help shape the minds of our nation's future military leaders by providing an outside-the-box perspective.
So many U.S. military personnel have been deployed to resource-rich countries, to oil-rich countries, and have fought and have died. There have been enormous losses around the world from fighting in these countries. I'm hoping to promote awareness of other kinds of things that we can do to stop the problems before they arise again. And we need to be aware that this problem could get a whole lot worse before it gets better, because there are many low-income countries that are just starting to find and just beginning to produce new hydrocarbon resources. There may be as many as a dozen countries in Africa that 10 years from now will become oil and gas exporters. Okay? We need to be thinking in advance how we can help the people of those countries address these problems so that we don't have to, down the road, send in our forces to intervene in other ways.
Stay with us. We have more after the break. Retired Commander and NPS alum Everett Alvarez Jr. endured one of the longest periods as a prisoner of war in American history. He recently sat down with high school students to discuss his experience. Petty Officer Chablis J. Torrance has the story.
Students at Everett Alvarez High School received a special visit graduation day. NPS alumni retired Commander Everett Alvarez Jr. and NPS active duty staff members spoke to the students in Salinas, California as they prepared for graduation.
The school is named after me, which is a tremendous honor, and I feel very grateful for the community to have named the school way back about 20 years ago now.
NJROTC Commanding Officer Antonio Montrell was honored to receive Mr. Alvarez.
I was nervous. I really was. Once Chief told me that he was coming, it was such an honor for me to meet him.
In August of 1964, Alvarez was the first pilot to be shot down and held as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. Alvarez is the second longest held POW in American history, having spent 8.5 years in captivity. Alvarez came to tell members of the school's Navy Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, as well as regular students, about his experience as a POW and naval aviator, and to encourage students to listen to the stories of current active duty members.
It was an honor to talk to them. And what I really get out of it is the extreme interest. They hang on to every word that is said, and their eyes are wide open. And I mean, it's just like holding their breath, because obviously not only my story, but I'm sure yours too, Chief, and the commander and the chiefs over here. It's part of their education, their exposure, and even though they've seen movies, you hear stories, but to hear real live experiences from those individuals, from myself, I think is, I would say, very enhancing for them and for their, in terms of their future plans and goals, which is really important too.
From the Naval Postgraduate School, I'm Petty Officer Chablis J. Torrance.
Well, that's it for this edition of Inside the Naval Postgraduate School. Thanks for watching. I'm Petty Officer Danica Sermons.